In this video, we're going to go over set builder and interval notation with these three examples. So the first thing that you need to consider is the domain of the function. And for our number one, it's a rational function, and we know that denominator cannot equal to 0. Denominator, we have x, so I'm going to set x cannot equal to 0. Therefore, our set builder, I'm going to write x such that x cannot equal to 0 because we're talking about all real numbers. For interval notation, as I just mentioned, we're doing all real numbers except 0. So I'm going to use regular parentheses, union 0, infinity, because we're including numbers that are very close to 0, such as -0.1 or positive 0.0001, and so on. Now let's look at number 2. Underneath the radical, we cannot have negative values. First, I'm going to factor 1 minus x squared. Then the factor form will be 1 minus x, 1 plus x. However, we can have radical 0. So I'm going to let that equal to 0. Then my x will equal -1, 1, and use a number line to test out which numbers are giving us positive and negative. So we mentioned that -1 and +1 are good because radical 0 is perfectly fine. Now I'm going to choose a random numbers to my left hand side, like -2. If you want to choose -10, that's perfectly fine, but any number smaller than -1. So here I chose -2 and then substitute -2 our given function, which is radical 1 minus x squared. Then radical 1 minus -2 squared gives you radical -3. -3 is not acceptable. So now let's choose a number in between -1 and 1, like a 0. You can choose -0.5 if you want to, but I don't like fractions. So when you choose 0, radical 1 minus 0 squared gives you radical 1, which is a positive value. So any number between -1 and 1 is good. So let's choose lastly number beyond 1, like let's choose 3. You can choose 2, you can choose 5, doesn't matter, right? Any number greater than 1. And when I substitute into our given function, radical 1 minus 3 squared gives you 1 minus 9, which is equal to radical -8. No way, right? We cannot have negative number underneath the radical. Therefore, our set builder will be x such that x is in between -1 and 1. And including those values for interval notation will be bracket -1, 1. Now let's look at number 3. 3 is a combination of 1 and 2. So we mentioned that denominator cannot equal to 0. We also mentioned that we cannot have negative values underneath the radical, right? We cannot have negative values. That's not okay, right? So therefore, I'm going to cheat from number 2 and number 1. It will be x such that x between -1 and 1, but excluding -1 and 1. Because when you substitute -1, radical 1 minus -1 squared gives you 0, but we mentioned that cannot equal to 0. Your denominator cannot equal to 0. And same thing for +1. But interval notation, you're going to use regular parentheses because we're excluding -1 and 1. So it will be soft parentheses for your interval notation.